You may well see some overlaps between the work that I'm going to be presenting here and the work that Fred just presented. I am also an experimental psychologist, although I feel very much like I'm not an experimental psychologist at the moment because I haven't been able to do any experiments with any people. So much of what I'm talking about now is theoretical and my thoughts on the possible and material agency and the possible. So I'm interested in people's thoughts afterwards. Because we have had this idea the whole way through from Vlad's first presentation, I thought I'd bring it back to us, this idea that possibility thinking is an exploration of what could be, what is to come, what could have been, and what is not or will never be. And I'd like us to imagine a dice falling through the air. At the point of the throw, there are 6 possible outcomes, all equally statistically probable. When the dice comes to fall or comes to settle, there are no more possibles. There is only a single actual. What is, what was, and 5 possibles that will never be. And depending if you have money riding on that roll of the dice, the closing of those possibles may or may not be catastrophic. In this respect, it seems somewhat counterintuitive to have a talk entitled Material Agency and Possibility. As Fred has kind of alluded, possibles are not material concepts. They're not tangible. They're not real, whatever we mean by that. And I'm not even going to get into that discussion now. So the moment we grant the possible material form, we reify it and actualize it and therefore erase it. And as I was writing this and thinking about this, I was reminded of the nothing in the never-ending story. This is a picture of it. So for those of you who didn't have the pleasure of growing up in the 1980s, the nothing was this rolling curse. It's a film called The Never-Ending Story, set in the land of Fantasia. And around the edges of this fantasy, wonderful land, the nothing grew and grew, and it slowly erased all possibility. And the heroes of the film had to run away from the nothing, had to try and create the possible. And I don't disagree with this. Actualizing, reifying a possible does erase the other possibles. You know, imagine a wood carver faced with a block of wood. The first cut narrows possibility. The block of wood, which could have been a bowl, a plate, a goblet, it loses possibles. It takes on an actual shape and form. However, I wish to focus on this process of reification, the act of making the possible actual, to explore how material possibilities coalesce with human possibilities and expand the possibility space in a way that cannot happen without some form of material engagement. In other words, that this, and another inverted commas word, dialogue, facilitates the emergence of novel possibility spaces, not just improbable, but impossible in the static world of brain-bound imagination. And here I make a reference to Margaret Bowden's critique of combinatorial creativity. Creativity, she argues, must require more than something statistically improbable. And so I suggest that interacting with the actual expands our sense of the possible from the improbable to that which, without material world, is impossible to even conceive. So how are the possible and the actual related? Well, first, I invite us to recognize we do not operate in infinite possibility spaces. Not all things are possible at all times. Rather, the possible is shaped by different levels of constraints, from micro-level situational affordances to broader cultural scaffolds. The space is not static, it's dynamic, of course, but it is boundaried, and its dynamism comes from the shifting of these boundaries. And this time, the nothing from the film of my childhood becomes a something, the rolling forward, not of a dry actualization, but the generation of more and more possibles, which only happens through the reification, through the actualization of those possibles. When I was watching The Never-Ending Story in my pajamas on a Saturday morning, the world of YouTube and on-demand films live streamed to my phone, it actually was dormant somewhere there in that overplayed video cassette, but it existed nowhere in my mind. We can understand the possible as residing in the space created by the interaction of material and human perspectives. And this dance between potential and actual, I think, widens, structures, and defines the possible. Such a thought is captured by the idea of the adjacent possible, which has been most recently explored by Leonard Bjornborn in his piece for the Encyclopedia of the Possible, that great work that Vlad's working on. But he builds on foundational work from Stuart Kauffman and Stephen Johnson. And Stephen Johnson describes the adjacent possible as thus. The adjacent possible is a kind of shadow future, hovering on the edges of the present state of things, a map of all the ways in which the present can reinvent itself. Yet it is not an infinite space, nor a totally open playing field. The number of potential first-order reactions is vast, but it is a finite number. And as each adjacent possible is realized, it opens up a series of other possibles. And so it is the existence of a fluid possibility space populated by people and things, which means that a focus on body-bound individualistic thinking will limit our understanding of the possible as it unfolds over time. I don't believe we simply construct the possible in our imagination or our language and leave it there. Instead, we construct it in the world, and the possible then emerges from its own creation and is further created by the interactions between the actual and the possible. So as it's actualized, new possibles are created. And this is such a continuous dynamic process. It doesn't make any sense in such a process to talk about the possible as a property of anything other than action and interaction. And on this view then, with the possible and the actual, they're not in opposition. They support each other through the mechanism of the adjacent possible. Actualizing generates more possible. And my argument is that the process of engaging with material possibilities opens up a greater sense of the possible than human agents could alone. Vlad has written of the social ontology of the possible, in which he suggests that to conceive of the possible, we need to view it as an interaction between people in the context of society. The view of the possible relies on perspectival changes and shifts. And of course, I agree wholeheartedly with this. I agree with everything Vlad says. But I also suggest that such shifts can be wrought by objects as well as people through action. Yes, it is true that we can see further by standing on the shoulders of giants, but we can also see further by standing on a ladder, by wearing glasses, by using a telescope, extending our bodily properties far beyond the human possible by encasing them in metal and flying around the world to the moon. And if we get to the moon, and we're armed with a telescope, then what possibles could be envisaged that our small human minds never could? So how does this perspectival shift with things and objects work? Well, objects are normally considered inert, passive, background scaffolds. Even some of those the really sort of materialistic researchers think of them in this way, that they're recruited by an agent. Olakowski writes, materials are generative. They serve as the basis for other creative work, facilitating the performance of activities that would have been impractical without material augmentation. But I think that materials can do more than that. And I think we need to reconsider our understanding and use action, which Vlad has also pointed to as the cradle of the possible, to cement the two together. The joining of the human and the non-human arises through action. And this perspective then opens up possibilities that we'd never conceived of before embarking on this, what I'd probably call a joint cognitive project. I suggest that materials have a knowledge that is inaccessible to human understanding. And it is through interaction with this knowledge that we can understand and enact our possibles. We can go even further than our own perspective and give an agency to materials around us, allow them to contain knowledge which we as humans don't have. And I suggest that it's this interchange of human and non-human knowledge, of human and non-human agency, which drives the possible. Consider, for example, a scientific experiment. Andrew Pickering shows us several times how the practice of scientific discovery, of rendering possible the potential, requires engaging with materials. And when you do that, losing a sense of agency, the control of the possible shifts. In his book, The Manual of Practice, he traces several scientists as they tinker with scientific instruments to capture the material knowledge they wish to access. In this particular instance, he's talking about Glaser and creating a bubble chamber. I didn't understand the physics behind it, but I understood the process of tinkering backwards and forwards with that scientific object. And Pickering writes, my suggestion is that we should understand the history of the bubble chamber as a more or less violent tuning process, involving the continual refiguration of material setups in the pursuit of an intended capture of material agency. Now I can clarify my sense of material agency. It is simply the sense that Glaser's detectives did things. They did things, boiling explosively or along the lines of tracks or whatever, and that these things were importantly separate from Glaser. As he goes on to write, this performative idiom moves into a space in which human actors are there, but are now inextricably tangled with non-human, no longer at the centre of the action and calling the shots. I would suggest as well that this engagement with material opens up knowledge which is only held by the material, and in that generates possibilities, what I will call material possibilities, right? And it is this combination of material and human knowledge that, for me, denotes serendipity, which I have to mention at least once in every presentation, but it's only time it's being mentioned here. But it does lie behind what I think I'm describing. And of course, the very existence of an empirical scientific program demonstrates the limits of human imagination. Scientific discovery arises through experiments with material. New, unanticipated things happen when materials are set in motion. If this weren't necessary, we could just mentally project forward, right? We could just rely on thought experiments. That we don't. That we feel the need to run our ideas into the hard wall of what reality, but maybe this is better described as material knowledge, material possible. This demonstrates the role that the actual plays and the limits of our brain-bound possible. Material is central to revealing that which we did not know was possible. Material possibilities overlap with and extend human possibilities, pushing the boundaries of the adjacent possible further out. Thinking about the possible, about thought and creativity in this way, requires, just as Fred said, a different sort of investigation. I'm going to go back to Pickering, because I would do. And this is the way he looks at a sort of what he calls a cybernetic ontology of life. Things in this sense just happen. This is my basic sense of emergence, a sense of brute chance happening in time. And it is offensive to some deeply ingrained patterns of thought. The latter look for explanations, and the closer to the causal mechanical explanations of classical physics, the better. Well, it seems to me that in the analysis of real-time practice, in certain respects at least, none can be given. I can do nothing about this, but it's best to be clear on this point from the start. This world lacks the comforting causality of traditional physics or engineering, or of sociology for that matter, with its traditional repertoire of enduring causes and constraints. I must add, and this is the important part I think from my perspective as a researcher, I must add though that in my analysis, brute contingency is constitutively interwoven into a pattern that we can grasp and understand, and which, as far as I'm concerned, does explain what's going on. So from my perspective, when we move from the endpoint backwards, we risk turning the path which led to the eventual outcome into one which was directed that way from the start. Let us take again the role of the die, which opened this presentation. We see the 6 on the face of the die, and we trace back the actions which led to that 6 being thrown. And perhaps if we're psychologists, we impute some intentionality into those actions. The 5 other numbers are disregarded because the outcome of the throw has rewritten them. They are no longer possibles. They are that which did not happen. This colours and subverts any ongoing research if you're starting from the endpoint. Rather, I suggest we should trace forwards from the widest possibility spaces and work forwards through practice to see what the effects are. Rather than ask, how did the wood turner make a set of goblets, for example, we should be asking what happens when the wood turner engages with the compressed possibilities in that wood. It does go against many deeply ingrained patterns of thought, and it doesn't lend itself to many scientific paradigms that I know of, but I suspect it's the best way we can investigate these things. And I also suspect it is closer to the practice of science as it unfolds in very real scientific laboratories, materially rich and populated by embodied people. And so I think this is key to how we understand the possible, not as a mental projection, not as some kind of daydream from an isolated brain-bound individual. Well, this would limit the possible to a combinatorial game using what we already have to spin endless cycles of regress. There would be no progress in this world. The possible would be static without these opportunities to actualize, to engage in material possibilities and combine the two. And I think a static possibility would quickly dissipate and become stale.